So, this next section is titled Target Pollutants. And this is a pretty hefty section, but I'm going to do my best to go through it really thoroughly because it's one of the more important pieces about the standard because it does get a bit technical. So, to begin, I'm first going to show you two slides that are illustrating the reset air targets. This first one is for core and shell. And the second one is for commercial interiors. Now, these are the requirements that are necessary, but please note that these pages are referenced in the standards. You don't necessarily need to memorize them, but you certainly are expected to know them. And what's really equally important is that Reset is not creating or inventing these thresholds. These are not arbitrary numbers that we are making up. But in fact, we are actually using best practices from international institutions and other authoritative bodies that are in the position to make those decisions. So we actually are not deeming what is considered a healthy level, but rather we base these threshold limits on organizations such as the World Health Organization, the US EPA, ASHRAE, and other bodies who are in positions of authority to make those kinds of decisions. So as an AP, I think it's just really important to reiterate that Reset is, we are not in the business of designing thresholds, but rather we are pointing to those institutions who set those thresholds and make those decisions because they are in the position to do that. And to start this section about air, again, as an AP, I like to give you tools to explain what reset is in an elegant way. And I like this slide for that reason. Because it says a lot by actually illustrating what I think is truly important about air. We can survive for weeks without food, days without water, but only a few minutes without air. And health really begins with air. So let's use the analogy here, or comparison rather, of water for 1 second. It is recommended that we consume 8-ounce glasses of water per day. That's 3 or 4 liters of water per day in order to maintain health, as mentioned. And yet, in comparison, we actually breathe 15,000 liters of air per day. So in comparison, that's a lot more. Why is it then that we are not more concerned about the type of air that we are breathing? I don't think any of us would make light of drinking water from a dirty water source. We would question it. And I think recently in the US, this has become a real issue. We've had some problems with polluted water sources, and it's high on everyone's radar. Why is it then that, given the fact that we actually consume so much more air per day, why is it that we don't know much about it? So in these next slides, this is what I'm going to try to go into, which is further detail about just that. What is in our air, and why is it so significant? We're going to start with CO2. So in this slide, I think on the left, this typical business operating cost figure is something a lot of us have probably seen before. There's a few studies who have put it out in a couple of different ways. This one is by the World Green Building Council's Health, Wellbeing, and Productivity in Offices report from 2014. And what it's showing here is that the cost of staff is a significant part of what it takes to operate a building. You'll see it's 1% for your energy costs, 9% rental, and 90% is attributed to your staff costs, that's salaries and benefits. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a small snapshot from a very important, rather seminal study that came out called the Cognitive Function Study by the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Center for Health and Global Environment. So with this study, they actually were focusing on what it means to have better air quality in a space and how does that affect productivity. And this is only showing a couple of the impact categories going across the bottom there: crisis response, information usage, strategy. But what they found, of course, are numbers that are almost unbelievable. With increased ventilation rates that were really not that significant, you can see numbers in increases in productivity that are almost too difficult to comprehend. An increase in 300% in productivity when the air quality was improved. And what's so interesting about this Harvard study is it's not just a mix of ventilation and a couple of other things. They did that as well, but they really did do a study that focused wholly on CO2 levels. So what's so significant about this then? If we know that 90% of companies' cost is its staff, its people, and then according to the Harvard study, the COG function study, a doubling of quality of air can double productivity for certain tasks. So it's no surprise then that companies, both large and small, are taking note of this, because for the first time, we now have information from respected institutions that are kind of pointing out what I think previously was just common sense, but couldn't really truly be harnessed. And this is a game changer, because now we're actually getting some scientific validation, again, from highly respected institutes to help leverage with real numbers. So this is actually a carbon dioxide hazard scale, and you can see starting from the bottom going all the way up that this is actually showing for the first time that CO2 is not just a proxy gas that tells us we need a better mix of air in our space. We either need to have increased mixing or more oxygen. Impairment, which is what this graph is showing us, happens at about 1,500, and that is also documented in the Harvard study as well. So when we actually are looking at these numbers, CO2 is actually getting a little bit more significant in factoring what is considered good quality air in a space. So as we see, documented that there's a 50% drop in performance as levels of CO2 go up beyond 1,400. And at levels of 2,500 parts per million, you have what is called here cognitive dysfunction. So again, CO2, it's not just this tracer gas that tells us we need to open the doors or windows, but rather it's getting a lot more significant for us to design buildings that can handle levels of CO2. And this again is reiterated in this study, which was from 2012, where you've got your impact categories again going across the bottom, covering everything from task orientation to basic activity. And then you've got your increase in productivity according to what your building is capable of going up on the side. So the impact of CO2 on human decision making and performance is again being illustrated as being far more important than we have previously given it credit for. And one of the cool things about being involved in what we do and studying these types of effects of indoor air quality is we get to partner with really interesting teams that are doing great work. And this particular study was administered by Gensler in 2016. And in this study, they were creating 2 conference spaces because they wanted to study the effects of a green wall in the space in respect to levels of CO2. So they created 2 conference rooms that are identical in every way. They were zoned the same. They had the same HVAC delivery system. They were set up with the same types of tables and chairs. Everything about them was identical, except one had the green wall and the other room did not. So the green wall room was called the green room, and the room that was devoid of a green wall was the gray room. So they used the same 3 people for the study. And if you notice, they're not talking, they're not engaging in conversation, they are just working. So they did this for 5 months. They put these 3 participants into these 2 rooms and they collected data. And the results at first were kind of a no-brainer. I think that what was delivered is what everybody was predicting, that in the green room, the CO2 levels were expected to drop. So the data analysis that you can see here, the green bars that are going across the graph are showing what was happening in the green room. The gray obviously is showing what was happening in the gray room. And over in that top right-hand corner, you can see the percentage of time where the CO2 levels were over what was considered the healthy limits. So again, no big shock here. The plant wall room was expected to affect the CO2 levels, and it did. So CO2 was a little bit lower than in the gray room. No big shock there. But because we have data from continuous monitoring, we were able to find something that was actually rather significant. So if we really look at what the data collected is showing us, the 2 hours before the occupants are in the room are shown here. And it's at a fairly low level, nothing too significant about it. But as the 3 people move into the space, note what is happening to the CO2 levels. It's actually exceeding in the gray room beyond what is considered a proper level for making decisions. So just in those 2 hours, when those 3 occupants come into the space, the CO2 spikes. And then what the monitors actually show us is how long it takes for those CO2 levels to dissipate again. Now, what is so interesting about this is think about this for a second from a design professional's perspective or a programming perspective. What is it that a conference room is really designed for? Well, it's designed for meetings. And how long do most meetings actually last? A couple of hours, typically. So the real kicker for this case study is actually how it's showing that within just an hour, levels of CO2 are passing beyond the 1400 point, which is the impaired thinking. And this is important because what happens in conference rooms? Again, maybe you've got upper management that are calling meetings. You've got quarterly meetings that are happening. And you're making decisions that affect the entire business. And these might be financial decisions that are multi-million-dollar decisions, and they're being made when your team is cognitively impaired. So what continuous monitoring was able to show us is that in spaces that we design, we need to understand how to make them more responsive. That if we can get feedback, and if we can receive it in a way that is constructive or immediate, we can be dynamic with it, and we can be more effective for the moment at hand and for what the rooms are really designed for. So I'm going to now jump into VOCs, which stands for volatile organic compounds. But before I do that, I want to have a quick review of a couple of terms here in chemical toxicity, because it's important. The first thing to mention is dosage. Everything is toxic given a certain dose, including water. So that is not a very good way to be measuring your spaces. Chemical toxicity by dose is not a good way to leverage anything. Persistence is something that we do need to be concerned with, but it is also contextual. There are chemicals that break down extremely slowly that we have created, and in fact so slowly that they persist maybe over our lifetime, our children's lifetime, and our children's children's lifetime. And that is different than the persistence of other chemicals and other types of chemicals of concern. And for instance, snake venom, which is highly toxic, it's not persistent. It's designed to actually go back into the earth. It is genius that way. Man-made chemicals that persist are ones that we need to be highly concerned with. And this last term, bioaccumulation. There are chemicals that cannot be eliminated from the body. They build up until they reach dosages that are crippling or lethal. And this is highly concerning. And some examples of that are heavy metals or dioxins. And this is where we get the term PBTs from, which is persistent bioaccumulative toxicants. And Bioaccumulation is something that often is seen at the top of the food chain. So humans, whales, other creatures that are now being researched, and finding that the chemical burden that is in these animals is due because, like I said, they're at the top of the food chain. As they consume other creatures and other animals, the chemicals are building up in their system because of the chemicals that are in the creatures that they consume. So BPTs, this is certainly something of concern. And again, this is just a little bit of chemical 101 to be aware of before we go into this conversation of VOCs. So what are VOCs? VOCs are, again, it stands for volatile organic compounds, and they are carbon-containing compounds that evaporate at room temperature. Now, unfortunately, the use of the term VOC has created a lot of misunderstanding when applied to indoor air quality. And I'm going to take the next couple of slides to explain why. VOC content is different than VOC emissions. And the US has done a really good job of confusing these two terms. Other countries have dealt with it a little bit better, but in the US, we have used the term VOC to apply to both indoor and outdoor quality standards. And this is largely due to the US EPA's regulations on VOC content in products in order to manage outdoor air pollution. So the content definition in that context is measuring the quantity by weight of a very specific set of organic compounds in a product. And those very specific compounds are only those that contribute to the formation of tropospheric ozone, in other words, smog. And this is a very different definition than what we are concerned with in RESET when it comes to indoor air quality and target pollutants. What RESET is concerned with is what I have put here on the right when we're talking about VOC emissions, the off-gassing that results from any product and is measured to calculate the potential occupant exposure after installation. So VOC is an off-gassing, is really dependent upon time and temperature and humidity and vapor pressure and a whole host of other things. But the one thing just to remind yourself is that this is not a weight calculation. VOCs are not based on a weight calculation. And so still many organizations, including manufacturers and suppliers who make building products, even certification organizations, have come to think of VOCs as only those chemicals that are regulated by the EPA to control outdoor air pollution. And they use that same definition and apply it to indoor air purposes. And that is the wrong thing to do. So in RESET, again, we are concerned with off-gassing, VOC emissions. So where do they come from? Well, they are extremely common in building products, building materials, particle board, OSB, glues, paints, carpet backing, that type of thing. And I think one of the ways I help people understand where VOCs are is in thinking about how we have created product in this modern age. We've become extremely good in our industry of taking perfectly good materials like wood, crushing it down to tiny little bits and pieces, and then pressing it back together into something else, into some other material. So what's in that binder that's holding all those parts and pieces together is typically what is troublesome. That's the culprit, the binding agents. So these chemicals are deeply embedded in products like OSB and plywood and laminates, and they can off-gas for years. And so that's that persistent issue that I was talking about earlier. And it's often exacerbated by humidity. So VOCs, they don't have really strong bonds, hence the term volatile. They off-gas at ambient temperatures. But they can off-gas even more quickly and in greater volumes in hot, humid environments. And what are the health impacts? Well, they're known to cause headaches and rashes, nausea, vomiting, nose bleeding, all sorts of fun things that none of us want to experience. And most egregiously linked to nasal cancer. And I think if any of you were around in the 80s, you'll remember the term sick building syndrome. That was coined back then as a result of a lot of people becoming ill from being inside spaces where we had really tight envelopes and lack of ventilation and materials that were very much unregulated and had all kinds of these chemicals in them that were off-gassing. But my question is do you think that we have solved the sick building syndrome problem? We don't hear about it very much anymore, but where did it go? I think we would be kidding ourselves if we actually thought that we have solved the problem of sick building syndrome. I think we don't hear about it as often. It's sort of become passé, but I seriously doubt that we have actually wrapped our arms around the problem of materials off-gassing in spaces and making our air harmful. So it's important to note that VOC emissions, this is a generic term, and it can have slightly different definitions depending on the country and the industry. So this is separate from the content and emissions conversation, and still means that there are different terms for emissions in different countries, and it really depends on what we're talking about. So just be aware of that. The other part is there's harmful VOCs and maybe VOCs that are a little less harmful. Let me just make it clear that clean air should not have any VOCs in it. And there's no knowledge of any good or healthful VOCs. But certainly there are very harmful ones, formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, for example, that we actually really need to be very, very cautious of. And then the TVOC, total volatile organic compound term. TVOC, just to be clear, is not a health metric, but rather it is a way to let me know if I have an interior space that is very high in chemicals or is devoid of chemicals. So think of TVOCs as your total hygiene metric. And if your TVOCs are very high, maybe you need to come in because it's a bit of a red flag that your space is full of chemicals and you need to do a little bit of detective work or diagnostic work. But really what Reset is trying to do when we're talking about TVOCs and how VOCs are emitting in a space is really to avoid this scenario. We have a construction phase, which is obviously where manufacturers are giving us materials. We have our construction team that are coming in and they're installing those materials, and we have quite possibly a hazardous space. However, hopefully the people who are putting in these materials have protective gear and they are knowledgeable about how to deal with these materials that could be unhealthy. Then we go through this flush out phase. And we air out the building according to standards or to our own volition, and we think that we have a safe space. We move everybody in, and we start occupancy phase. But we pull in materials and furniture. We have all of our supplies. We've got office supplies. We have cleaning products. And occupants themselves come in. And you'll see that our VOCs actually climb back up to these unhealthy levels again, but we're not as aware of it because we think that because of the flush out, we have a space that is healthy. So to make a point of this, we have a study where this project actually performed a flush out according to what was outlined in another certification program. And following flush out, the project immediately did a spot test and passed their indoor air quality assessment. But at the request of the client, we put continuous monitors in the space post flush out for about what is 5.5 days here. And I'm going to come up on the screen so you can see. So this is the timestamp going across the bottom. And these bars here are indicating 0 hour to 0 hour. So this is actually 1 day. So you can see our days going across the bottom. And you can see our TVOC chart, the numbers going up on the left. So this is the flush out period, and after which we actually installed the continuous monitoring and started to look at what was happening in the space. Now, these signature peaks and valleys from the monitor data are actually showing us when the HVAC system is turning off and on. So you can see that the HVAC system is trying to do its best. The VOCs are climbing up when the HVAC system is off, and they're actually dissipating when the system is on. They're climbing up when the system is off and going down when it's on. The problem is that the VOCs keep building up and building up and building up over time, so that in just the space of 6 days, the VOC levels are going so high they can't even be tracked. They're no longer even on the chart. So even with the best intentions of flushing a building out, in as little as a few days, the VOC levels can build up to unhealthy levels. So a similar project, again, continuous monitoring. This project actually did a very small renovation. They patched a little bit of wallpaper, they did some touch-ups on some wood varnish, and we were tracking again over time. So we have our timestamp here on the bottom, and this is actually over the course of 12 days. So we have 1 day here, 2nd day, 3rd and 4th days. And again, we've got our tracking for our VOCs going up left-hand side. Now, the monitor was actually prior to this dash line in a different space. So we are actually concerning ourselves with what's happening during this period. And again, you'll see these signature peaks and valleys, which are indicative of the HVAC system turning off and on. So what's really interesting, though, about this project, and different than the office space, is that if we look at the timestamp of when our VOCs are actually climbing to concerning heights, is during the night from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now, why would this be a concern? Well, again, I mentioned this is not an office space. So what if I told you this was a 5-star hotel? So again, quite different in context, because I don't think that a 5-star hotel would feel very good knowing that at night they're giving their occupants a high dose of VOCs while they're sleeping. So again, what's really important to note is with continuous monitoring, it's giving us information that is contextual, that we would otherwise not be aware of, so that we can actually be reactive to it and hopefully put in some measures to remediate and fix what could be going wrong. So particulate matter is our next pollutant. This parameter is probably the one that has received the most press. And I think a lot of people have been hearing about it in the news. But I just want to take a second to explain for those who might not be familiar with some of the terminology. This is a really great illustration. On the left, you can see what is helping us to understand the size of particulate. So particulate matter that is PM10 is dust, pollen, mold, and it's shown here in respect to a human hair. So you can kind of get some idea. It's tiny, it's hard to imagine, but in comparison to that is what's important here, PM2.5. So 2.5 references particulate that is 2.5 microns in diameter and very, very tiny and not discernible by the human eye. This is concerning because PM2.5 is the size that the human body has no defense. These are particles that are so small, they get into our system, they have the ability to pass through cell walls and get into your bloodstream. So illustrated on the right-hand side is exactly that. And actually even more concerning, what's cropping up recently are nano-sized particulate. These are even smaller than 2.5, and they're concerned with the size of these particulate and react into the body yet again. Um, and yet we are only starting to really understand the impact of these particulates on the human body. And as the conversation for outdoor particulate starts to grow and evolve, we are really starting to turn to the indoor air particulate as well. And I love this slide because not only is it one of our oldest slides, but I think it really is starting to illustrate this point. What is indoor particulate? What is dust? What is it exactly? So on the left-hand side in the sample, you can see just a slide showing particulate, just dust. On the right, a dye was added so that it would color anything that was synthetic. So basically what this is demonstrating is that indoor dust, indoor particulate, is comprised of all the things in our interiors decomposing. It's basically the world around us falling apart. So the chair you are sitting in, the clothes that you're wearing, the wallpaper on the wall, the desk that you might be seated in front of. It's all of your world falling apart and decomposing. And in our modern manufactured environment, dust is almost entirely synthetic now. And basically what it means is that we are eating and breathing our man-made world. And this fact is really brought to the fore when, again, we look at outdoor particulate as a growing global problem. Particulate matter is a mix. It's a cloud of particles from all kinds of chemicals that blend and combine and react with one another as they travel. And I want to give credit yet again to Gensler with their firm-wide research report from 2016, where they're illustrating here that particulate matter is starting off as one thing. And it's combining and becoming a chemical soup made up of a set of particulate, or maybe a dominant type of species. But what's happening is that it morphs into something entirely different by the time anyone has the ability to test it. So what we arrive at is this type of situation where we have these Frankenstein particulate is making it extremely challenging, if not impossible at all, for us to sometimes know what particulate matter really is. But for the most part, when we talk about outdoor air and pollution, most countries, this is an example of the US EPA, most countries are considering the air pollution as an agglomerate of several different pollutants. And in this case, US EPA looks at ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. And this is important because when we talk about particulate matter in reset, it is different than an AQI. Some of you might actually look to see what the AQI, the air quality index, is when you go outside, or you want to see if it's a safe day. Maybe not so much in the US unless you're in EPA areas of non-containment, but certainly in Asia, India, China, people rely on an air quality index often to decide whether or not they're going to go outside, go for a run, if they need to wear a respirator or not. But it's really important to understand that AQI is useless unless you really understand what they are using for that scale. And in even those cases, it is an arbitrary number. It's a unitless scale. In this case, the AQI that the EPA uses to just describe a general air pollution level. And as mentioned, it's made up of those pollutants on the previous slide. And it will show the highest pollutants. So the AQI can be high even if particulate matter is low. So this is actually a little bit dangerous because it's not really giving you all the information that you might need. An API is a unitless scale that China uses. The Ministry of Environment uses it also to describe pollution levels, and it's different than the AQI that the EPA uses. So that adds another layer of confusion. So really what I want to stress here is this last box, which is talking about mass concentration. And this is micrograms per cubic meter. And this is really the best way to understand what the particulate is in your air. It is what all health standards use, and it allows you to compare numbers regardless of the country or the equipment type. But you really need to be aware of this unit, micrograms per cubic meter. So this is also what Reset is using and asking for when you measure particulate matter. So I just want to show this slide because, again, it's talking about risk of death from air pollution related diseases. And the World Health Organization has its overlay of morbidity. It uses these 5 different impact categories you see on the side: ischemic heart disease, stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer, and children's lower respiratory disease. As exposed to an annual average of PM 2.5, you can obviously see this drastic increase in death, a risk of death from exposure to air pollution. And so it's obviously something that we need to take extremely seriously. And of course, a lot of press in areas that are highly polluted, like China, like India. So lung cancer in Beijing has risen 56%. Cancer is the leading cause of death in China, and it's claimed thousands of lives each year. And even though this seems very China-centric, I'm going to go into a lot more detail with other global issues as particulate matter impacts everyone. It's a global issue. It is not just something that we are concerned with in China or in Asia. And to really drive that point home, children are more susceptible because their immune systems aren't fully developed and because they breathe a lot more than we do, 50% more. Animals also, pets, are more susceptible, I would like to add. So it affects everyone, the elderly, children. This is a global problem. And as I've mentioned before, as PM travels and morphs across as it moves, we need to be highly sensitive to what might happen to all of us on the planet. And PM affects our brains as well. Regardless of where you are, these particles accumulate in body fat and in brain tissue. And once they get in there, they're locked in there and we can't get rid of them. So again, this is that bioaccumulative danger that I started talking about at the beginning of this module. And we're finding out that particulate pollution has an impact on brain function. It's being attributed to things like autism, Alzheimer's disease, learning disabilities, even depression. So the last parameter that I want to talk about is CO. Now, just make sure that you understand as you're talking about Reset, CO only needs to be monitored and reported if there is an area of combustion or in areas adjacent to where combustion might be present, such as above or below parking garages, heavy industrial areas and facilities, commercial kitchens, that type of thing. So CO2 for a long time has been on everyone's radar as what was called the silent killer. CO is impossible to see or to taste or to smell, which is why it is particularly dangerous and also why we decided to put it on the standard. It's breathing air with high concentrations of carbon monoxide reduces the amount of oxygen that's transported to your bloodstream, and it can cause death very, very quickly. So one of the greatest culprits contributing to CO in outdoor air comes from cars and trucks and vehicles burning fossil fuels. But because there is such a high potential of it coming into buildings, because every building is a little bit different and every HVAC system for every building is really different, we again decided it was truly important to put this parameter on the the list of pollutants to track. But again, this is only in projects where they have areas of combustion or areas that are near combustion. Okay, so again, as promised, I'm coming back to the 2 slides that started this module off, so we can look at them again under the lens of what you've just learned. Showing the current thresholds and pollutants as outlined in the standard. And again, this is showing core and shell. Now, you might be wondering about those other pollutants that were mentioned, formaldehyde and ozone. How come those aren't included in the reset requirements? That's a great question. We wholly recognize the potential harm these pollutants can have on both people and the environment. However, we are limited by both technology and the current market to make them requirements. You have to understand that for every pollutant, there needs to be a sensor developed in order to detect that pollutant, and it needs to be reliable. And so for some of these pollutants, formaldehyde, for example, they're just not there yet. The sensors just haven't been developed in order to actually track that pollutant reliably. And in other cases where the sensors are getting there, ozone, for example, we do have sensors and we do have that technology, but the price tag of them is so exorbitant that it just would not be fair or responsible for the standard to demand it. But having said that, the sensor and monitoring market is moving incredibly swiftly. And the moment there is technology on the market, those parameters will be added to the standard accordingly. But for now, the focus is based on realistic parameters, pollutants that can be monitored, and reliably tested at scale. Now, I want to address one other thing that you're probably seeing on this slide, which is this asterisk under PM 2.5, under our minimum target for core and shell. When outdoor PM 2.5 is greater than or equal to 48 micrograms, and indoor levels basically can only be 12, that is a given. That is something that must occur. Now, when outdoor PM 2.5 is greater than 48, so on those really polluted particulate days, the building's filtration has to handle cleaning up of that air and remove 75% of the particulate matter at minimum. So this is really what we call a protection factor, and it allows that minimum target to be a hard number, but a dynamic number, depending on the situation. So on those really horrible, what we call apocalyptically horrible air pollution days where particulate matter is just ridiculously high, we allow a bit of realistic protection, because a team to actually be expected to hold a minimum target of 12 on those days would be almost impossible. So by showing that your HVAC system is designed to protect at least by 75% and hold that 75% protection factor through the duration of polluted days is our attempt at making it a reasonable target, but also a significantly important one, because a protection of 75% is something that is noteworthy. A project designed that way deserves to have a certification. So the other piece that I want to mention is in the commercial interior targets, you'll notice that we have a minimum target and high performance targets. And this is a little bit related to what I was just talking about in areas that have severe pollution. But it might be that it's across multiple pollutants, PM 2.5, TVOC, CO2, CO. There's areas in the world where reaching a minimum target is going to be incredibly difficult for them. And if they do, they absolutely deserve to have some kind of celebration and we think a reset certification. But we did not want to make the standard regional, because as much as we would all like to assume that areas such as India or China and the East have really high polluted days, there are days in every country where pollution can be incredibly high. And I would like to note that even in the West, when we have had terrible forest fires raging over months, PM levels actually were just as high as some of the worst days in China. And currently, we are now in May of 2018, we're experiencing a volcanic eruption in Hawaii, where particulate matter is dangerously high in that particular state on that island as well. So everybody needs to be aware of this idea that there are minimum targets and high performance targets. We would love to encourage everyone to meet the high performance targets. And if you are so lucky as to live in a region where those are feasible, you absolutely should be aiming for them. That should be your goal. But in areas where you might have very polluted city, you might be next to an industry that is polluting your air, you might have things that are beyond your control. We would like to at least have a level playing field, and hence we have given a minimum target so that everybody is at least welcome to come in to play. And again, when it comes to interior spaces, most of those pollutants can be generated not just by infiltration, but by the occupants themselves. So we think that having these two targets gives teams a lot more leverage to make the standard applicable for them. And with that, that actually wraps up this section of pollutants and brings us to the next module, which is going to be talking about accredited monitors.